Good afternoon, everyone. It's just after 12 o'clock. My name is Craig Kiger, and I'm with Minnesota DNR Outreach, and I'm going to be your host today. Um, our guest speaker is Josh. And Josh, tell me your last name again.
It's Blankenheim.
Blankenheim.
Yep.
And Josh is our large lake specialist up on Lake Superior. So Josh, go ahead and fill in the folks a little bit about you, and then you can jump right into your presentation.
Sure. Okay. As Craig said, my name is Josh Blankenheim. I'm the biologist for the Minnesota waters of Lake Superior. I've worked in this office for, oh gosh, over a decade now of my 17 years with the DNR. So it's a great place to be. And I'm happy to talk to you folks today about lake trout. And what we're going to do is sort of have two parts to this talk. We're going to start by just sort of reviewing the history of lake trout and Lake Superior, because it's really, if you're not familiar with lake trout and Lake Superior, it's really a unique story and a successful story. So I want to spend maybe 10 minutes or so talking about where we used to be and where we are today. And then after that, we're going to get into actually how you fish for lake trout. So I want to answer questions like, where do I go? What do I use? Do I need a big boat to do this? What does a bloody nose and monkey puke have to do with lake trout fishing? I will explain that and more over the next half hour. So let's see. Whoops. First, just a little bit of basic biology. Lake trout are the top native predator in Lake Superior, and there are three different morphotypes or body forms of lake trout in Lake Superior. One is called the Siskoet, and that is the deep water form of lake trout. So these tend to inhabit waters deeper than 250 feet or so. Not always. They do come in shallower, and they do come up to the surface to feed, but they are the deeper water form, and they have a higher lipid content in their body tissue. And you can tell them apart from lean lake trout, which is the one beneath it in this photo, sort of by, more than anything, by head shape. So Siskoets have more of a rounded, shorter snout, slightly bigger eye, sort of bigger fins. Sometimes they have more of a pot-bellied appearance, but not always. And lean lake trout, they're a little more slender. The biggest differentiating factor in terms of morphology is their head shape. They tend to have a very straight snout. And this is the fish that you as anglers want to catch. They have a more typical lipid profile to their body tissue, and they're found in shallower waters, usually 240 feet or less. Although again, not always. In some of our survey work, we've seen them down as deep as 400 and some feet. So there's some mixing there. And then there's also what's called the humper morphotype, and it's kind of an intermediate one. They have fairly large fins, sort of a semi-rounded snout, and they don't typically get real big, and they generally inhabit reefs far offshore. We don't see a lot of those in our neck of the woods. We mainly see leans and Siskoets. Siskoets by far outnumber leans just because of how much deep water there is out there. People have found Siskoets down as deep as 1,000 feet, so they are quite abundant. They spawn in the fall, and lake trout grow slow. They mature at roughly 7 to 10 years, and they can live over 40 years. And they get quite large, over 40 inches and 40 pounds. The current state record here in Minnesota is about 43 pounds. In Wisconsin, it's 47, and in Michigan, it's about 61, I believe. And I've seen some pictures of some released fish in recent years that, had they been kept, I would think they would have been pretty close, if not beyond, our current state record. So they get quite big. And lake trout are a very opportunistic feeder. What we see a lot of times in the spring during one of our main surveys is that they eat a lot of smelt, like this one here. It's very common. But then as we get into summertime, they eat a whole variety of different things in addition to smelt. They will eat other fish species. This particular fish happened to eat a couple of fairly large cisco. They will eat mysis, which is a little freshwater shrimp type critter. Surprisingly to some folks, they eat a lot of terrestrial insects. So they will come up off of the bottom and feed on the surface at night, eating things that wash in or blow in to the lake. So they'll eat a lot of terrestrial ants, wasps. We see all kinds of things like that. Um, Also, other things. This was a shrew or mouse. I, I fairly regularly see birds or bird parts, a snake, and this particular Siskiyou actually ate a bratwurst. And believe it or not, this is not the only time we've ever seen this. So one of my personal goals is actually to catch a lake trout. This is actually a Siskiyou lake trout, but I'd like to catch a lake trout on a bratwurst sometime. I think that would be quite the accomplishment. Okay, so moving on to where we were. So we've had a rich history of commercial fishing in Lake Superior. So what this figure is showing you is the harvest in thousands of pounds of lake trout back to about 1920. So if you look back at that time period, there was 3, 4, even 500,000 pounds of lake trout being harvested from Lake Superior by commercial fishermen. And back then there was up to 400 individual commercial operators, commercial fishing. And what we saw was there started to be a decline in the 30s. Overfishing became a bit of a problem. But something monumentally bad happened in 1938. And that was the introduction of sea lamprey into Lake Superior. And what they did, if you're not familiar with a sea lamprey, you can see one hanging on my arm in that photo. They're a long, slender fish. They grow to about 18 inches. And they've got a suction cup mouth with rows of teeth, and they've got a rasping tongue. So they are a fish that came from the Atlantic Ocean, and they were able to get into the Great Lakes through modifications to shipping canals. So they got into Lake Superior in 1938. Now, out in the ocean, they don't necessarily kill their host. They're a parasitic fish. But once they got into Lake Superior, and they started feeding on lake trout and other species, those fish oftentimes would not survive a lamprey attack because they would attach and suck out bodily fluids and whatnot, and lake trout would die. So they were first noticed in the lake in 1938. It only took about a decade before they were very well established. And you can see in this figure here, the lake trout population crashed. Commercial fishermen were still trying, but they just weren't catching anything because everything was getting killed by sea lamprey. Paper clippings like this one from 1957 is just a great example. Lamprey may destroy lake trout fishing this year. And if we were to read through this, the biologists that they interview are talking about the wounding rates on lake trout from sea lamprey. And they were seeing wounding rates of 80, 90, even sometimes 100% of the fish that they would survey would have lamprey wounds. These days we see about somewhere around 5% or so of the lake trout that we see in our surveys have lamprey wounds. So, and besides commercial fishing over harvest and the invasion of sea lamprey, there were some issues with habitat degradation as well. I think one of the most famous ones is probably the Reserve Mining Company issue. They came online back in the 1950s, and they were an iron ore producer. And so for every ton of iron ore they would produce 2 tons of waste material. And they just pumped that right into the lake. And that there was estimates that they would pump in a railroad car of mining tailings every 2 minutes around the clock for 25 straight years. And that if you read through accounts of some of the older commercial fishermen and some of the historic documents, there's a lot of controversy about that, and commercial fishermen complaining about not being able to catch fish, and habitat degradation and loss, and water quality suffered. So we look back at the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It was really an ugly time in terms of lake trout. And it got so bad that in 1962, we closed the commercial fishery for lake trout and did not allow harvest anymore. So in terms of rehabilitation, 2 things really had to happen. And The first was that sea lamprey needed to be controlled. And what happened was that back in the 1950s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began experimenting with chemicals to try to find one that would selectively kill lampreys, but not other fish. And they tested over, I think it was over 5,000 or 6,000 different chemicals before they came across one that worked quite well. And that chemical is commonly known as TFM. And what it does, it doesn't kill adult lampreys. They use it in streams where lampreys spawn to kill juvenile lamprey before they can become adults and be parasitic. So what they do, and along with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, which is sort of their counterpart, they do all the sea lamprey control around Lake Superior. And once this got started, it was hugely beneficial. So we were able to start sort of knocking back sea lamprey abundance. And they use other means too. This picture in the lower left is a trap full of sea lampreys. So they use some other various methods, but chemical treatments in streams is still by far the most common way to keep sea lamprey numbers in check. And I want to be clear about this, that this wasn't something that just happened back in the 50s and 60s. They still do it every single year, and there's no way currently around that. If we did not have sea lamprey control in Lake Superior, we would not have a fishery. It's just as simple as that. But estimates right now in terms of sea lamprey abundance, they figure we're probably at about 10% of peak lamprey abundance historically. So that was hugely important. And once sea lamprey became somewhat controlled, we could start stocking efforts. And we were lucky here in Lake Superior because we didn't have the total loss of lake trout that some of the other Great Lakes experienced. Okay, we still had some remnant populations that persisted through all of this. And we began here in Minnesota a stocking program back in the 1960s. And I want to point out that even though we can point the finger to some extent at commercial overfishing for part of the demise of lake trout, they did have a hand in rehabilitation, though. So in these early years in particular, commercial fishermen would go out and collect fish to get eggs for the hatchery programs, even though there was very few fish out there. So it was a lot of work for really not a lot of reward for them, but they were willing to do it and do their part to help with the program. So over the years, we stocked upwards of 500,000 age one lake trout per year. And as you can see, after 2015, there's nothing. And what we did, or what happened, was that as we began to stock more and more, lake trout were surviving and those hatchery fish were reproducing. And then those fish were reproducing, and we started to see a lot more natural reproduction once we got like into the 90s and 2000s and where we are today. So we actually met criteria, actually well before 2015, but in 2015, we looked everything over and had met criteria that were established by not just us, but agencies around the lake when it was acceptable to quit stocking. And we met those criteria, and so we ceased lake trout stocking, and today we rely solely on natural reproduction. And these days we see about 90% or more of our lake trout in the spring survey that we do are wild fish. There's still some older hatchery fish out there, but right now lake trout in the Minnesota waters, Lake Superior, are basically self-sustaining. So this is a huge success story. It took many, many decades, but for all practical purposes, we consider lake trout to be rehabilitated in our waters. So that brings us to today. Today, the fishery is a robust one, and it provides an annual average sport harvest of about 24,000 fish per year. We have a 3-bag limit with no size restrictions with those fish. We do have commercial harvest. If you think back to that figure I showed you with commercial harvest, you could see it started back up in 2007. We do allow a very, very minimal amount of commercial lake trout harvest. It's monitored very carefully. One of the big parts of my job is to do all the permitting and oversight of all of our commercial programs. So it's definitely not, like a free-for-all or anything like that. It's very tightly monitored. And we do assess the lake trout population through a variety of annual surveys. I'm not going to get into the details of that today. But one of the main things is that we want to see total annual mortality stay below 40% for lake trout. So what we look at is basically lake trout die in one of three ways. They're going to die of natural causes, of disease, old age, things like that. They're going to die from a sea lamprey attack, or they're going to die because a fisherman keeps them. So collectively, we want to see mortality stay below 40%. If we do that, then our population should remain stable. So if you're thinking like, hey, I want to try fishing Lake Superior, where do I go? So this figure here, map shows the 10 places that you would launch from. So starting in the very southwest corner, there's Rice's Point, which is right at the tip of the lake. Moving up the shore, there's McQuaid Safe Harbor, which is a relatively new harbor. Knife River Marina, and then beyond that is the Two Harbors Harbor. Further up the shore, there's a small one called Twin Points Safe Harbor. Beyond that, you would come to the Silver Bay Marina. That's a little bit bigger place there. Then it's kind of a gap for a ways. There's a Taconite Harbor, which is just a wonderful little spot. I was actually there yesterday for work. And then you get up to Grand Marais Harbor. Again, that's a little bit larger one. Beyond that is Horseshoe Bay Safe Harbor in Hoveland. It's a beautiful little spot. It's really a neat little bay. And then Grand Portage has a marina as well. So if you're going to go fishing, you're going to leave from one of those spots. And if you're going to fish, you're basically going to do one of two things. You're either going to troll or you're going to jig. There's a lot of water out there, and there's a lot of empty water. And so trolling is sort of the mainstay for lake trout on Lake Superior. You can cover a lot of water. It's fairly effective. And you're not going to be using, your 6-foot graphite walleye rod for this. That's not really the tackle that you'd use. What you do, what you should have ideally is like a 7 to 9 foot trolling rod, and they're fairly long rods. They're quite soft. They bend quite a bit, and I'll show you why that's important shortly. You typically use conventional level wind reels rather than spinning reels with this sort of setup. And if you're going to go out and buy stuff, I would recommend getting ones with line counters. So you can see it. I got a picture there of a reel with a line counter. And what that does is that little counter shows you how many feet of line you have out. And that's going to be very beneficial in some situations, which I'll get to in a minute. You can use either braid or monofilament, anywhere from roughly 15 on the light side up to 50-pound test. If you're going to use monofilament, I would sort of stick on the lighter side. I wouldn't go 50-pound monofilament. I've got 2 rods rigged up with 17-pound monofilament for trolling. That works fine. I also have 2 with braid, and there you might go a little bit heavier, like 30 or 40 or something like that, just because the diameter of braid is so much thinner than monofilament. You can use a heavier line. I've got 30-pound test on mine, I think, and it's the diameter of 8-pound monofilament, so it's very thin but strong. If you do use braid, you do need to use monofilament or fluorocarbon leaders. You wouldn't tie your lure directly to braid. There's a few other options out there. These are a little bit less common. Lead core is one, and as the name implies, it's a lead core with a nylon or Dacron sheath around it. And the benefit of using a line like that is that it sinks, so it allows you to get your lure deeper, easier. And usually it comes on a spool, and the line changes color like every 25 feet. So if you don't have a line counter reel, you know how much line you have out. Probably not quite as common as just using braid or mono, but it is an option. And so is copper line, which is a similar thing. It's heavy and helps you get lures down deeper. And you can use 2 lines on Lake Superior. I just want to mention that. This is a picture from my boat. You can see I've got 2 rods out in this instance. Let's see. Oops. Okay. Mouse keeps skipping around. So in terms of how you're going to troll, there's a couple of options. I'm going to start with planer boards. Now, this tactic, if we're talking just lake trout, it's mostly a spring tactic. People do use it all year round because what you're doing here is getting baits out away from the boat, but not really down deep in the water column. And oftentimes in spring, lake trout can be up fairly close to the surface. So this technique can be useful. People will use it throughout the year if they're interested in catching other species as well, like salmon, cohos, and Chinooks. They oftentimes are nearer the surface, so sometimes people want to run numerous options. But if you go this route, there's two ways you can do it. The first is with planer boards that attach directly to your line, which I've got shown on the left-hand side of your screen. And again, those pull your lures out away from the boat. You're not going to achieve a whole lot of depth with them. And the way those work, you can see there's like two clips on there. When a fish hits, it pulls your line out of one of those clips, and then the other still keeps your board tethered to your line, and it kind of falls back as you bring the fish in. And a lot of them have little flags like that, and if a fish hits, it actually, most of them, they usually cause the flag to go down, not up. The other option is to use a mast with bigger planer boards, and that's depicted on the right-hand side of your screen. And the way that works is you have a mast and like a sort of a thin cord, and attached to that cord you have these bigger planer boards, and those, again, they pull your lures out away from the boat, and then you attach your line with a release mechanism to that cord. So when a fish hits, it pulls your line off that release, and you can fight the fish. So this is just a picture from actually last weekend. I was out. You can see there's sort of an orange cord going out to a yellow board way out there. That's a planer board out there, and then my line is actually attached to a clip that's about 2/3 of the way out. So that is one option. Again, mostly a spring thing for lake trout. We're gonna get into some of the more common tactics now. Dipsy divers is a very common one. And what a dipsy diver is it's a disc that dives, and it can also pull your lure away from the boat. So in this picture here, you can see the top of this one on the left-hand side, it's kind of a purpley color. On the bottom side, the white side, there is a screw, and that allows you to turn a disc. And if you look at that, you can see there's a right and a left and some numbers on there. And in this one, I've got set to pull off to the right at a setting of 1. So you can set it to pull right or left depending upon which side of the boat you're going to deploy it. And this is where line counters really shine, because they come with little charts like I show here. And based on the setting that you have your dipsy on and how much line you put out, you will know how deep your lure is running. There's also apps for that, so you can just plug in how much line you have out and what your dipsy setting is and what your speed is, and it'll tell you how deep it's diving. So they're very, very simple to use, and like I said, they dive and pull away from the boat. And on the right-hand side of this screen here, you can see I've got a picture of one that's in the untripped position. So that little wire that is attached to the fishing line, in that setting, it's diving and pulling. When a fish hits, it pulls that little wire out, and then you can see that in the lower picture there, in that tripped position. And that allows you to not be fighting the resistance of the dipsy diver and the fish. You're just fighting the fish then. And the whole thing, if we look at it in the very bottom of this slide, you can see there's a dipsy diver. Then there's a snubber, and a snubber is just a piece of rubber tubing that stretches. It's a shock absorber. You don't have to use these. A lot of people do. It's just meant to keep a big fish from hitting hard and breaking your line. So you go dipsy to the snubber, and then roughly 4 to 6 feet of monofilament or fluorocarbon to your lure. And again, you don't have to use snubbers. I would say if you're going to use braid as your main line, I would probably put a snubber on there just to be safe. But that's how it works. If a person wants to probably say just dabble a little bit and not spend a lot of money, this is probably the simplest way to just test out fishing on Lake Superior for lake trout. These come in different sizes. This is a size 0 in this picture, but they make bigger sizes that can dive down to 100 feet. So you can get quite deep with these. Okay. The other main staple for trolling is downriggers. And this is a photo of a downrigger. There's several parts to it. There's a spool with a crank arm, and on that spool is wire cable. And this is just a manual one. They make them electric, so you don't have to hand crank them. But I'm not that fancy, I guess. I just do it the old-fashioned way. So that wire cable comes off the spool around a pulley, and then you're going to attach a downrigger ball to that wire cable. And I've got a picture of one on this slide here. And on the ball, you attach a release. And your line is actually going to go in the calipers of that white release. And what you do is let down, you attach your line to that release, and then you let the ball and your line down at the same time. And then once you get to whatever depth you want to fish, you just engage the brake on the downrigger and make sure your reel is engaged. And it's very, very depth controlled fishing. So if you want to be down 70 feet, you just drop the ball down to 70 feet or 100 feet or whatever you're going to fish. And then when a fish comes along and hits your lure, it will pull the line out of that release mechanism, and then you're free to fight the fish. You're no longer attached to the downrigger configuration. And this is where that long soft rod comes into play. Trolling rods are meant to be under load like this. Like I don't have a fish on in this picture. I'm attached to that downrigger ball still through that release. So usually when a fish hits, the rod will snap back briefly. There can be a little bit of slack for a moment. So that's where these trolling rods are, this is what they're meant to do, unlike regular fishing rods. So somebody might ask a question of, okay, well, I want to do that, and I want to bring my spouse or a kid or a friend out with me. Do I need a downrigger for every line I'm going to run? Well, no, you don't. And what you can do is you can stack multiple lines on one downrigger. And I do that if I bring a friend with me and we're gonna use downriggers. And what a stacker release does, I've got a picture of one here, and there's a little sort of snap swivel type piece, and that's just meant to keep it tethered to your cable. So in this sort of little drawing here, you can see there's a downrigger ball and then a release with the first line, and then above that, what you do is you take one of the calipers and attach it to the cable. The other goes to your second line, and then you've now got two lines working off of the same downrigger and downrigger ball. And you don't put them right on top of each other. You'd space them out, 10 feet or 20 feet or 30 feet or whatever you want, so you can fish different depths. But you can certainly put more than one line on a downrigger ball. In terms of other important things, speed does matter. Generally, 1 to 2.5 miles per hour at the fastest is typically what you would do for lake trout. And if you've got an engine that's a little big and you can't quite get down that fast, you can use drag bags, or you can get a trolling plate that helps block some of the prop wash from your prop. Or if you really get into it, you can just buy an extra auxiliary motor like a 5-horse or 9.9 and use that if you're trolling. Or depths you should be fishing at, it's very, very highly variable depending upon when you're out and conditions. We think of lake trout as a species that's often associated with the bottom, and they often are. When in doubt, I tell people go out to at least 100 feet and fish near the bottom. It's a great starting place. But they will suspend throughout the water column, especially if we get into summertime. A lot of times, if we start to get some stratification of the lake, you might want to try fishing around the 50-degree mark, wherever that is in the water column. Sometimes it's down 50 feet, sometimes it's down 70 feet. And it can all change depending upon winds and currents. Believe it or not, there is actually a lot of current out in Lake Superior. So this can all change, but I'll show you a site where you can find temperature information in just a little bit. In terms of lures, there are a number of options. Stick baits is a staple, especially early in the year. Those are fairly popular. Dodgers and flies are another very common offering. And the way these work, a dodger is like a metal plate, and it's got a little curve on each end. And what you do is you attach an offering behind it, like in this case, like a mylar or tinsel type fly. So it looks something like this. And generally, you'd run it your fly about 18 inches or so behind your dodger, and that dodger will wobble back and forth, and that gives that fly action. So these are very common uh, for when you're fishing for lake trout. And they come in different sizes and colors and all that good stuff. But by far and away, the most common thing is trolling spoons. And earlier on, I said, well, what does monkey puke and a bloody nose have to do with lake trout fishing? Well, spoons come in with lots of different colors and sizes, and they have some very creative names. So the 5 I've got laid out here are monkey puke, which is one of my favorites, Wonder Bread, bloody nose, gin and tonic, and watermelon. And the list could go on and on. There's the greasy chicken wing, uh, 57 Chevy, reverse 57 Chevy, the Joker, and on and on and on. There's just a lot of choices, but very effective for lake trout. Now, if you're not really into trolling, like I don't like trolling, I find it boring or whatever, you can jig for lake trout. Very, very fun, and it's a great tactic on structure. So if find a bit of a hump or reef, comes up out of some deeper water, that can be a great place to jig. And generally for a jigging rod, you'd want something that's got some backbone, maybe a fairly fast action rod. But if you want, like I've used my 5.5 or 6 foot bass rod, uh, and I've caught fish on that. So it's not like you have to go out and buy something new if you're going to jig. But you need something sturdy enough uh, for the size fish you might catch, and the tackle, which I'll talk about in just a second. But in terms of line, again, probably 20 to 50 pound test. I would generally give the nod to braid for jigging because you're going to be jigging in generally 100 to 200 feet of water. So you're going to have a lot of stretch with monofilament. So just keep that in mind. Again, if you use braid, I would go with a monofilament or fluorocarbon leader. Hair jigs, really big tube jigs, and jigging spoons are pretty common. The reason you need some backbone to your rod is because you're going to be using jigs that would be roughly 1.5 to 3 ounces. We're not talking little 1/4 ounce jigs. You need something that gets down deep. And you can tip these sorts of jigs with smelt or herring or Cisco belly. Just make sure you check the regulations so you understand what you can use for bait. Other gear. So if you're going to go out, you need to have safety gear. So anything that applies inland also applies to Lake Superior. So you have to have Coast Guard approved life vests for everybody on board. If your boat's big enough, you need a throwable. Fire extinguisher, the correct number and size for your size vessel. You need working navigation lights. You are required to have a sound producing device, either a horn or a whistle. Just your voice does not count. And if you have a boat with an enclosed cabin, and you need a CO detector these days. The biggest difference is that if you're on Lake Superior, you must carry Coast Guard approved visual distress signals for both day and night use. And the easiest way to meet the requirements for both is to have pyrotechnic devices on board. And they can either be handheld flares, like those sort of stick-looking things in this picture, or you can get like little pistol-type deals that shoot them off up into the air. There's other things you can use, but this will cover both day and night. And they do have expiration dates, so you have to make sure that when you're out, you have ones that aren't expired on board. You can keep your old ones on board, which is what I do, just as backups, but you do have to have ones that are not expired to be within the regulations that the Coast Guard requires. Other things to have, a compass, because it can get very foggy on Lake Superior and you won't be able to see shore. It's very common in the summertime. A marine VHF radio is a good thing to have. I mean, not necessary. You don't have to have one, but if you turn to channel 16, that is the channel that the Coast Guard monitors for distress and other boats as well. So, if you had a problem, you could go to channel 16 and radio somebody. If you're fishing downriggers and you get hung up, if you get a ball stuck on the bottom, it might be a good idea to have wire cutters in case you couldn't get it free. First aid kits, things like that. Also, boat electronics, of course, are very useful, so you know how deep of water you're fishing in and how fast you're going, and of course, marking fish too. Lastly, a word on the weather. Small boats are fine on Lake Superior. My previous boat was a 14.5 footer, and I would take that out in Lake Superior, 25 horsepower motor, very small boat, but I only take it out on choice days. The weather really matters, and it can be glass calm out there, but it can change from that to something really ugly in pretty short order if the wind kicks up or if a storm rolls in over the hillside. So you do need to really pay attention to the weather if you're going to go out on Lake Superior. Generally, east winds are the most problematic ones in terms of wave height, simply because there is a lot of fetch or distance that the wind has to work with if it comes from the east in terms of creating big waves. Northwest winds are much easier to work with in terms of wave height because there's just not that distance for the water to get kicked up. Fog, as I mentioned, can be an issue, and the water is cold. And sometimes the surface warms up quite nice and it's not bad at all. But I have seen surface temperatures less than 40 degrees in July. And it doesn't matter how good of a swimmer you are, nobody's going to last long if you were to capsize or go overboard and couldn't get back to your vessel, in those sorts of temps. So you need to be aware of some of the dangers of Lake Superior if you're going to go out. It can be great, but just be aware of those things. Lastly, some helpful links. I mentioned water temperature. UMD has several buoys deployed every summer out in the lake, and they have temperature loggers down to at least 100 or 150 feet. They also measure wave height and wind speed, and you can go to that website and see their real-time data. We post a fishing report once a week. The link is here. And you can also sign up for text and email alerts if you want it delivered straight to your inbox. And I am a big fan of the NOAA Marine Forecast website. I check that for work on a basically daily basis. They give wind and wave height predictions for various parts of the nearshore waters of Lake Superior. And lastly, there are some special regulations if you're going to fish Lake Superior, and those can be found in our fishing regulations. I don't recall the exact pages off the top of my head, but I would read through those 2 or 3 pages so you're clear on everything. With that, that's what I have for you folks, and we should have ample time for questions that people may have.
Outstanding, Josh. A lot of great information there.
Good.
We've got a couple of questions that came in, so we'll throw those out right away.
Sure.
Kathy said, I just read that there was an increase in sea lamprey again because of the lack of treatments during COVID. Is that true, and will treatments start again?
I recently heard something about that too. I can't say exactly what was missed in terms of treatments. We share a lot of our lamprey wounding data with them, which helps guide where they're going to go. But I did not hear specifically how much time they missed because of that. But I suspect they did miss some time due to COVID restrictions. But certainly their intent is to continue on. I believe they have some streams in Minnesota on their schedule this year. I don't know when exactly that's occurring, but no, they are back up and running, and they will continue to do the work that they do.
Good deal. Andrew has a pretty in-depth question here. Do you see any potential impact from the Buffalo Reef spawning grounds here on the Minnesota trout population? That
Okay, yeah.
the spawning ground off Kena threatened by spreading stamp sands.
Right, that's over in Michigan. I know there is some work being done on that. Last summer, we provided some genetic samples from the lake trout here in Minnesota waters to folks in Michigan, and what they were going to look at is to see if any of the fish that we have in our waters come from fish on Buffalo Reef, so that they're doing a genetic look at that. I have not heard the results of any of that yet. I'm not sure that they're done with it. So I think there's still some questions on that. but there is some collaborative work being done on that, and we have participated in that.
Okay. Mark wants to know what's the deepest depth recorded in Lake Superior?
It's 1,300 and I want to say 37 feet. It's 13 something.
Okay. So you did a really great job talking about downriggers and depth finders and fishing from your own boat.
Mhm.
I don't have a boat, but I'd still love to catch a lake trout. Is there anywhere I can go and fish from shore, or are there Minnesota launches that go out and target lake trout?
That's a great question, and I didn't address that, so I'm glad you brought that up. For fishing from shore, lake trout, that's pretty tough because they tend to not be real close to shore, except maybe a little bit in the spring. Your best chance there would be to fish off of um, break walls at some of the larger marinas, like Two Harbors or Grand Marais. You can, at certain times of the year, cast off those and catch fish. Um, Generally, you're not going to just walk down to the shore and wing out a cast and get a lake trout. You won't be able to get out far enough or deep enough.
Hmm.
But yeah, so if you don't have a boat, there are quite a few licensed charter captains in the area, all up and down the shore, and a lot of them do a really great job. And not just anybody can be a charter captain on Lake Superior. They have to be licensed through Minnesota, and there's a bunch of trainings and things they have to take too,
Hmm.
so they are a Coast Guard approved and everything. So it's not just anybody who
Yep.
can go out and do it. There's some hours spent getting prepped and ready to be licensed for guiding. But there's plenty of good choices all the way from Duluth, up to Grand Marais, and
Yep.
a lot of them are very very good at what they do. They have to report their daily catches to us, and one
Oh,
of my colleagues um, compiles all that, and so yeah, I can say there's some very very skilled fishermen, much better than me. So uh, yeah,
yep.
you can do some Google searches for charter captains and find some offerings there.
The lure selection that you put out, the
Yes.
spoon, the monkey puke, the bloody nose,
Yep.
Wonder Bread. Um, being a first time angler, I probably wouldn't want to go out and invest in all of those different lures. And the other thing I noticed is some of your spoons had trebles
Hmm.
and some had singles.
Right. That is some come with trebles, some come with singles. Some of those I think at some point uh, either my dad or I swapped out. It's part of it's just personal preference, I guess, more than
Mhm.
anything. Uh, I guess I tend to like single hooks better, but I don't know if there's anything, in terms of one is better than the other. It's personal preference, I guess, there.
So, like fishing up in Lake of the Woods, we fished jigging spoons through the ice, and we
Hmm.
would put a part of a minnow on the hook. Could you use those spoons as vertical jigging with bait, or that probably wouldn't work out that well?
Um, Vertical jigging spoons, yeah, I didn't show a picture of them, but if they're heavy enough,
Hmm.
a vertical jigging spoon would work okay. People use those, and I showed those big hair jigs. Those are very common. And I didn't have a picture of one, but some people really like big tube jigs, and not like bass size stuff. You can go to a store or look online for these sorts of things, and those can be very popular as well. But yeah, you could use, as long as it's got enough weight to get you down there, you could use a vertical jigging spoon and tip it with something. And lake trout, I didn't mention this, but during that part, but they do like to chase quite a bit, so it's not uncommon to get a fish interested and have it come up 40, 50 feet in pursuit of your jig or your spoon and
Okay.
hit that. So it's really a fun way to fish. Um, and there's people that are really, really good at it. Um, but it's just not quite as common as trolling.
Yep. And I was just thinking about your comment about the captains. and they're going to have the rods, the
Oh yeah,
lures,
yeah, yeah.
and you can go out and learn so much from just hanging out with those guys for the day and probably catch some fish,
Yes.
and then have a better understanding when you go to outfit your boat, um,
Right.
if you want to go
Yeah,
that route.
that's a good point. These guys, they do it on a daily basis, sometimes twice a day. They'll do
Hmm.
morning and evening charters or all day charters, depending upon what you want. But they're out there so much. They know more about lake trout fishing than I do, because I go out some and I catch fish, but I'm not a charter captain. I don't go out that much.
Yeah.
But yes, they have all the spoons, all the tackle. Generally, you go out with them. All you need to do is just show up, and they might, with the proper clothing, and that's about it. And a lot of times they'll clean your catch for you and everything. And yeah, they have all the tackle. It's pretty remarkable when you see one of their boats, just how many different spoons and stick baits and small
Hmm.
fortune those guys have on some of that stuff.
Got a couple questions just came in. Barry said, "What is the DNR data on lake trout barotrauma,
Mm,
barometric trauma,
right.
um, on released fish? Are superior lake trout able to survive being released after being caught at great depths?"
Um, that's a great question. We have not done a barrel trauma study. I don't know if we've ever done one, but Michigan did one a couple years ago, looking at hooking mortality, and I wish I would have reviewed that before this presentation. I thought of that. Oh, I should review that, because they did it just a few years ago, and they did find some mortality. It had to do a lot with temperatures, like when surface temperatures got above a certain threshold, they started to see more.
Hmm.
So it was as much, I think, temperature as it was depth at which the fish comes from. But that is something to be mindful of. If you're fishing really deep, there could be some issues there. But that was some work done by Sean Sitar and his colleagues in Michigan, and one could probably find that with a quick Google search, I would think, and I just don't remember the exact details off the top of my head. Um,
And,
that's one of the reasons that we don't have size restrictions on lake trout, is because there is that potential to have mortality from bringing fish up from very deep, or from colder water into warmer surface water. Like I
mhm.
said, it's oftentimes cold on the surface, but sometimes in the summer, it'll be in the 60s, or something like that. So um, that is one reason that we just say you can keep 3 fish. We're not going to restrict you to, they have to be, over a certain size or between a certain size, is to help avoid some of that.
So there's not a slot limit on lake trout like we have on walleye. You
Right. We do not have any
keep
sort
them.
of slot or minimum or maximum or anything like that. It's just 3 fish of whatever size you want.
Hmm. Kathy asked a good question. Are trout fighters like bass? And I'm going to just take a stab and said there's nothing that fights like a trout.
Um, they, well, I guess it just depends who. It's all relative, I guess. If you fight, like a big salmon, I guess I would say they fight harder than lake trout. Lake trout really aren't known for being a super hard fighting fish.
Hmm.
I, I'm not going to say that they're, just wimps or anything like that, but I think it's probably fair to say that there's other species that are a harder fighter than lake trout. But hey, if you hook into a 30 or 40 incher, that would certainly be quite a handful.
Our tech host Amber was able to find that post-release mortality study from Michigan, and it's up in the chat.
Okay, yeah,
You can click on that, guys, and it'll take you to that study.
yeah. I
Uh,
I, I know Sean. He's those guys over there, great biologist, and yeah, I off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact details of that, but they took a look at that, and we tend to reference that because we don't have anything you know that's been done at any time recently in Minnesota that would be
mhm.
any better than that, certainly.
So Barry was apparently listening in when we talked about learning, or fishing from shore.
Hmm.
And are we allowed to fish lake trout from shore in Minnesota in the spring with organic bait after the ice goes out?
By organic bait, I assume you mean live bait. Um, well, generally, we usually don't even have much for ice here most years. But yeah, you can. The only time you can't fish for lake trout is during the close season, which is in the fall. It closes. It's like it's the beginning of October. The calendar date changes a little bit. It's like the Monday after the first full weekend in October. You can't fish for lake trout from them then until November 30th, and then the season reopens. So outside of that window, you can fish from for lake trout from shore, whenever you want. And
Okay.
yes, live bait would be allowed. You just have to make sure you're following the rules
Hmm.
in the fishing regulations on that.
Jack wants to know, do lake trout migrate up and down the shore throughout the year, like I've heard some of the salmon do?
Yeah, it's pretty well known that the salmon certainly do. Like right now, you can catch cohos and chinooks more readily down here on the Duluth end than you can up in Grand Marais, and we see that shift throughout the summer. Eventually, they start working their way up towards Silver Bay and then Grand Marais. There's always some around down here too, but they do seem to make this loop up the North Shore. For lake trout, that that's a good question. Because they're everywhere, we don't like we pick up the salmon thing in our creel survey. We do a creel survey every year, so our clerks are seeing what people catch. Lake trout are all up and down the shore, so it's harder to gauge it from a creel perspective. We would have to do some sort of tagging study, like acoustic tags or something like that, to get a better handle on how much they move. So that's kind of a bit of an unknown in that department.
So we've learned a little bit about the fish, the subspecies, the tackle, the equipment to go out and catch them. But how's the table fare?
They are very good. I Some people, well, everybody's got their preferences. Some people say, oh, they're just okay. I think they're excellent. It, you can, smaller ones you can fry. Of course, grilling lake trout is probably the most popular way. Smoking them too.
Hmm.
If you have a smoker, that's great. There's some places in Duluth that will smoke fish for you. That's a great way too. With the Siskoettes, I mentioned them being a fattier fish. They actually have a higher lipid content in their body. They tend to be a little bit less palatable. I've eaten one or two, and they taste okay. There's just a lot of extra fat in them, and those are generally not what people are looking for. But overall, lean lake trout, yes, they are very good, and I wouldn't turn my nose up at them at all.
So do you think the Siskoettes were adapted for the deeper water, the higher fat content to regulate body heat then?
Yeah, a lot of it is because of the environment they live in, and if I recall, there's been some fairly recent research that has shown that they've actually gotten a little bit leaner in recent years for whatever reason. But yeah,
Hmm.
they're adapted to living down, 400, 500, 600 feet. We do a survey every 3 years that's sort of targeted at Siskoettes, and we'll set gill nets as deep as about we get out to about 600 to 700 feet, and there's all kinds of them down there. Yeah, so it's they're interesting fish, and Michigan has done some interesting work on them too, where they used a special tag that had a pressure transducer in it, and you could see the diel vertical movements where they would dive down during the day where it's deeper and darker, but they would come up all the way
Uh-huh.
to the surface at night and feed on those bug slicks
Wow.
and things that I talked about. And, so they're very, very interesting fish.
I know I told you in the practice session that a lake trout is on my bucket list of species, and Jeff and I have talked about it. as well. That's a species that he would like to add to his list of caught fish.
Hmm.
And you know, it's not that hard to get to the Duluth area from anywhere, you know, to
No,
come to
no,
fisheries.
if somebody's coming up from the cities, you're looking at, 2.5 hours or so to get to Duluth, and there's a lot more fishing pressure down on this end of the lake, but as opposed to if you're go up, towards Silver Bay or Grand Marais.
Oh yeah.
But there still is very good fishing down on this end of the lake. I mean, it's good. You don't have to go way up the shore if you don't want to. And if you a minimal investment in equipment would get you out there. Downriggers are going to be a little more expensive, but like I mentioned, dipsy divers, they're really not very expensive. And you get a couple of those and a handful of spoons. You don't need everything in the store. Just a
Hmm.
couple basic colors, and you can get started that way, and then decide from there if you want to do more of it or not.
So we're just about ready to wrap up. If anybody's got a last minute question they want to try and jump in, Amber's got a bunch of links in the chat for you guys to check out. Josh, it has been a pleasure listening to your story on lake trout and how we brought them back. Um, the fishing aspect sounds awesome, and it's something that I definitely want to do someday. Is probably go down and find a charter and go out and get them.
Yeah,
Um,
that is a great option. You can make it cheaper if bring a few friends or whatever, because usually you're just paying for the boat. You're not
mhm.
paying per person, so you can divide the costs amongst, 3, 4 people. Uh, and you can see what it's all about that way. And then, maybe you'll really like it and say, hey, I want to buy a little bit of equipment and do this.
Yeah, and there is just something special about that North Shore drive. We've taken the motor home and ran up and down the coast there, just looking at the sights. And we can add a fishing adventure in there somewhere. That would be a bonus. One thing we didn't mention was that you do need a trout stamp to chase lake
Right.
trout,
Yep.
and in addition to your fishing license.
Hmm.
But next week, guys, we are going to be episode 117, off-road vehicles, safety rules, and trails. So if you're a ATV or UTVer, this might be a good one for you to check into. But with that, we are up against our 1 hour time window. See how fast that goes by?
It was
But
quick. Okay. And I'll add that if anybody has any questions later on, my contact information was on there, and feel free to send me an email or give me a call if you want to talk about it any further. I'd be glad to answer any other questions that folks may have.
we had one more comment from Barry. Thanks for bringing Lakers back to Lake Superior. I love fishing Lakers.
Good.
I gotta scroll here.
I'm glad to hear it.
And Lake Superior has the biggest ones. So it's a success story, guys. And
It
it's right
is
here in Minnesota.
a very, very remarkable success story that took a lot of decades, but it's something I think that we should certainly make note of and be proud of here in Minnesota.
I see some clapping hands going up the screen. So great show. We'll see you guys next week. And Amber, if you can take us back to the practice room.